Hi, welcome to Extra Condensed. My name is Chris Meyer with Extensis, and today we have Greg Mitchell, CEO and founder of Font Shield. Greg, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be here.
We're really excited to have you here, and if you wouldn't mind, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your company and what you do.
Sure. My name's Greg Mitchell. I'm a type director with over 40 years of experience around typefaces, fonts, typography, typesetting, font licensing, font management, and compliance for advertising agencies and brands. What's important to know is that I am not a lawyer. However, I have solid knowledge of the font industry and licensing. So our mission at Font Shield is to support agencies and brands in the compliance and procurement of the fonts that they license so they can produce their deliverables worry-free. Our role is to mitigate potential legal issues due to the misuse of fonts. So while all that sounds very simple, it's not really. And a bit of background about the font licensing industry is font licensing is really confusing. And that confusion is the very thing that triggered the existence of Font Shield. So if you consider the current realities of the font industry today, there's 1 million plus fonts. There's hundreds of type designers and font foundries, and each have their own unique EULA, which is called an end user license agreement. It's completely erroneous to assume that all font foundries have the exact same licensing terms and conditions. Quite simply, they don't. They are all different. Above and beyond that, there's multiple models of licensing depending on how fonts are going to be used. There's a whole raft of them. There's desktop, web, digital ads, mobile apps, video, broadcasting, logos, social media, server, the list goes on and on. There's confusion around exactly who should be licensed for any use of a font, whether it's the agency or whether it's a brand or both. But these days, more often than not, both parties will be required to purchase some kind of licensing. Another factor in the industry is that it constantly changes. End user license agreements change all the time. So everybody has to be on their toes when they're trying to license fonts. This confusion, it leads to a lack of confidence around whether agencies and brands are adequately licensed for what they're producing together.
Great. And I'd love to get into the details of all that and discuss a bit about how your clients approach you and what types of issues that they specifically come to you. We will also want to talk about, how customers can now prepare for the end of support for PostScript Type 1 fonts and Adobe applications. And so why don't we start there? Greg, tell us how your clients approach you and what kinds of concerns and challenges that they face when purchasing and maintaining all of their font collections.
They usually approach me because of the very confusion I previously mentioned around font licensing. They're not confident in all the ins and outs of font licensing, and they just want to make sure that the fonts that they license are properly licensed for the projects that they are creating.
So, Greg, today we want to talk a little bit about Adobe's end of support for PostScript Type 1 fonts within their Creative Cloud platform. And so can you tell us, what does this end of support mean for our clients?
Okay, sure. A little bit of history about this end of support, about PostScript Type 1 fonts. So PostScript Type 1 fonts, they were introduced in 1984 by Adobe. And a new format called OpenType, which is referred to as OT, that was introduced around 1996. And as a result, font manufacturers stopped developing PostScript Type 1 fonts. It was phased out. There was no real reason for the longest time, actually right up until now, to switch to open type fonts if one already had purchased type 1 fonts. They continued to work well with the Adobe apps. However, Adobe announced that on January 1st, 2023, Adobe apps will no longer support PostScript type 1 fonts. So this likely would only affect older companies pre-1996 who originally purchased those PostScript type 1 fonts and never replaced them.
Mhm.
I mean, remember, these fonts are over 30 years old.
Yeah.
So PostScript type fonts as of January 1st, 2023 will no longer be viable.
Yeah, and we know at Extensus a lot of our customers still continue to use these fonts, and so how do you think this is going to impact their creative workflow?
Okay, so quite simply, Adobe apps will no longer see or recognize type 1 fonts. They won't appear in the font menu. They won't be able to use previously installed PostScript type 1 fonts. Any existing PostScript type 1 fonts in files, when you open up, they'll appear as missing. So creative choices and decisions on how to deal with this are gonna have to be made. Some choices are they going to replace that PostScript font with the identical typeface in OpenType format? Another option is to replace these fonts with fonts that somebody might already be licensed for, but are visually similar. And of course, what comes with that is client and creative departments would have to approve that change.
Right. And so what areas of their business do you think get impacted by having to change these fonts or fix these fonts?
So it's hard to determine how large of a problem this is going to be, and I truly think it depends on how old the company is. Did they buy these PostScript type 1 fonts 30 years ago? But any aspect of the business that previously relied on these fonts, from design, production, and branding, is going to be impacted. There's definitely a financial impact. Any type 1 fonts that are still needed in the exact same typefaces, they're going to have to be repurchased in OpenType format. And what goes along with that is the time required to audit and determine what type 1 fonts need to be replaced. There's time required to actually swap out the type 1 fonts with OpenType versions. And along with that is definitely time required for quality control, proofreading. Replacing those fonts with the exact OpenType equivalents or a similar alternate font, it's not a seamless thing. There's kerning and tracking, and line breaks will likely change. So proofreading's a must.
And so I hear you saying that the documents themselves that they have produced prior, I guess, would be impacted, or are you talking about just all new work?
No, prior documents. Again, mm-hmm. if they pick up a document that originally had type 1 font assigned to mm-hmm. it, that's going to be missing. So a Mac artist or a production artist is going to have to replace that font in those files with the new OpenType equivalent.
And so, do you think clients are aware of this problem? Are they conscious of what's going to happen, or do you feel like there's still a lot of awareness that needs to be shared?
Well, Adobe has been warning people that open files with the idea that PostScript type 1 fonts are going to be going away. So if the people that are working on those files push that information up through their chain of command, then they would know whether they've done something about it or not is another story. My gut tells me that there's still a lot of PostScript type 1 fonts living on people's computers and in their projects that are going to need to be dealt with.
Yes, our the data that Extensus has tells us that there's still about 25% of the customers that we support, they still utilize PostScript Type 1 fonts in new work. So definitely there will be impact there. And also a large percentage of those customers have admitted that they still go back and use old work, or they reference old work to create new work from those existing files. So to your point, they would be affected.
Yeah, January 1, they're left without a choice. This is not about a choice at all. This is going to happen.
So what type of advice are you giving them to improve this situation in their workflow?
Okay, well, PostScript fonts, basically it's get going. 5 months, we're at 5 months now. Will come and go quickly. So you need people that are dealing with these fonts need to give a heads up to their finance department that there's likely going to be unexpected expenses due to having to replace these fonts. So getting the word out to your organization and giving them a heads up about what's coming and their replacement options is key. They need to present information on how to detect the use of PostScript Type 1 fonts, both in Adobe apps as well as on a font server. Extensus has some good information on their website about that. Another good thing to do would be to provide a list of PostScript Type 1 fonts that are going to be removed. This list would have to be provided to certainly creative teams, but account teams as well, because they're going to end up having to deal with this. So the best way to start is to determine what current projects are in the works that use these fonts and deal with those first because they're the most urgent. And then secondly, find out what projects that you know get recycled at a regular frequency, jobs that get picked up on perhaps, like, for example, on a yearly basis. Right. And find out if they involve PostScript Type 1 fonts, because you're going to have to deal with them at some point in time.
What are some of the topics that you're discussing with your clients about their font libraries?
Agencies should know exactly what fonts they have in their font library, not just by their name, but what they can do with those fonts. They need to, if they're uncertain, they should audit those fonts. Considerations are all fonts licensed to your company, truly licensed to your company? If they are, you should have a proof of licensing in the form of an invoice. And do you have end user license agreements for each of those purchases? You need to know what your license allows you to produce using those fonts. And can all fonts in your library be used for any and all clients? Because that's not always the case. Does your client require their own additional licensing to deploy the work you've created using those desktop fonts?
I bet you a lot of agencies and people don't think about that.
No, they don't. They don't. Absolutely. And sometimes they work in a vacuum, and an agency might say, well, we have desktop font licensing, we're good. All right. Well, this is your agencies and clients from a licensing standpoint are joined at the hip, basically. It's no good to anybody if an agency has a desktop license, but the client doesn't have any of the necessary licensing in place to deploy what the agency produces for that client. For every font in your library, you should have documentation showing that you're the licensee or you're permitted to use the client supplied fonts on their behalf.
That's interesting. I would bet that agencies receive fonts from their clients all the time and don't think about the licensing associated with
that. That's true. And again, when fonts come into the agency, everybody has to stop and say, what are we producing using this font? Do we have our own license to use this font? And if we don't have our own license, does the client have a license that permits the agency to use that font on their behalf?
And so what types of non-legal advice are you giving your clients to improve their font workflows?
So specifically to agencies and designers, what's really important is vetting, and when that vetting takes place. So my biggest piece of advice is do not use and present fonts in comps and layouts to clients unless you've already vetted and have a full understanding of the licensing required from the founder who owns that font. So vetting should be done at the very beginning when font exploration is happening, not when comps or layouts, or not after when comps or layouts are being presented to the client, or even worse, when final deliverables are going out the door. That's just a recipe for heartache, because you could find out that the font is very expensive, or the licensing terms and conditions may be too difficult to reasonably manage. Another consideration is, what are the potential use cases of a font? Exactly what licenses are required? What's the cost of the font? You're going to have to present this to the client. They're going to need to know, and the sooner they know, the better. Exactly who, is it the agency, the brand, or both, is responsible to secure the required licensing for how the fonts are going to be used? And will the terms and conditions in the EULA be easy to comply with? So agencies, they must be prepared to inform brand clients of their own licensing responsibilities and costs. So vetting is far more than simply liking a font. It should be much more than, this font will be perfect for this project. So another issue, again, for agencies and designers is compliance. And we talked about having an internal font policy outlining the do's and don'ts that all employees must agree and sign to. Another huge help for managing fonts property is a dedicated font server. It's a must-have to store and be able to distribute fonts to only the users that need them. It's a centralized solution, and no fonts stored on local machines should be happening in your organization. It's all about control of fonts in your library.
Right.
And one last little piece of knowledge for brand clients. Brand clients should be checking back with their agencies to make sure their agencies have properly informed them of their own licensing responsibilities for the fonts they've used in your materials.
I bet a lot of clients don't even think about that when they get handed off work from their agencies.
Exactly. I see it a lot.
So, Greg, many clients are considering converting their old fonts, specifically the PostScript Type 1 fonts that we've been talking about. Tell us why that's a bad idea.
It's a real bad idea. So first and most importantly, virtually no founders permit that. They will not permit the conversion of their font software. It's very clearly spelled out in their end user license agreement. And doing so, it violates the EULA, and it puts agencies and brands at legal risk. You know, if you must have the same fonts, the same PostScript equivalent fonts, repurchase in the new OpenType format. A secondary factor is font conversion. It's inconsistent, and it can break aspects of the electronic font file, rendering it non-functional.
That aligns with the advice we give our customers here at Extensis, but it's good to hear it from a font expert that the reasons behind it being a bad idea. Well, all right, that wraps up this first episode of Extra Condensed with Greg Mitchell from Font Shield. What a great conversation. We're going to pick this back up, Greg, again in our second part. We're going to dig deeper into the business impacts. We'll talk about some of the resolutions that creative teams and their clients can explore in solving not only PostScript Type 1 fonts, but also managing and solving other font compliance issues that they might have with their font collections over time. So thank you again for sharing your time with us.
My pleasure.